IDOR, or insecure direct object referencing, is a type of vulnerability that has to do with essentially escalation of privilege, but also information disclosure. And the variety of different things that can happen with this sort of vulnerability sort of span those two paths. In general, we're going to be disclosing information that we shouldn't have access to, but the type of access control violation can be either horizontal or vertical. Horizontal means that we're accessing things that are sort of at the same level of our privilege. So, for example, if I am a customer with a company and I can access my customer information, if I can then leverage this to access another company's information, that would be a horizontal type of access control violation. Whereas a vertical access control violation would be something that I can access something more than what I typically have access to. It would be like escalating myself to administrative level views of the product or that sort of idea. So although horizontal also gives us a lot of information disclosure for things that we shouldn't be able to see, we aren't necessarily escalating permissions in a way that we can view things that are on a different level from ours. They're sort of same level but different interface rather than different level, different interface, that sort of idea, right? So as I discussed, it's a type of access control vulnerability, and the actual principle of it is rather straightforward and simple. And when we go over this idea, a lot of this you would look at and say, well, that's probably not something that you would necessarily see in commonplace. However, it happens a lot. This sort of vulnerability is actually shockingly common still to this day, and it's specifically something that a lot of inexperienced PHP developers will put into their product. So if you're ever looking for this, look for old PHP pages, any old things that are written by people who might be inexperienced or interns. But yeah, specifically old PHP pages are a great place to look for these types of vulnerabilities. I've personally actually witnessed this type of vulnerability from an application that I was using. I wasn't the one who reported it, however, someone else did, and I later read the reports and saw that this was what they used to exploit it, and that was something that was found maybe a year ago. So this isn't really a dead vulnerability, although it's not on the OWASP top 10 for the most recent list. It was on a previous one, so it's still something that comes up fairly frequently. So there's two types that are relatively common. There's a direct reference through the URL and a direct reference to static files. When we're dealing with URL-based referencing, essentially what we're looking at are these types of situations. You'll see here that on this localhost thing, I have a customer ID that I can input. And that customer ID is sent to the PHP page through a GET request. Since it's through a GET request, it shows up inside of the URL itself. In this case, it says customer ID equals 2. The key thing about this is that although it outputs the information for 2, I can change this to say 3. And you'll see I'll get company 3's IDs and stuff, right? So I can see all their information. So this is an example of a horizontal violation of access control, and it's through direct referencing in the URL. The problem here is that when I request this new ID, the database doesn't ever check to see if I actually have access to that ID. Instead, it just allows me to get access to it. So instead of validating that server side, it just assumes that whatever the client provides is what it has access to. So since it's completely client controlled, the client can change the customer ID to whatever they want, and they'll get access to whatever resource gets inputted there. So that's sort of the main reason why this vulnerability exists. If we ever want to stop this vulnerability, we just have to verify the input server side. So we'll get the variable through the GET request, and then we would check it up against some access control database to determine if this user should have access to that resource. If they shouldn't have access to the resource, we should reject them. Otherwise, we can accept it and let them through. You'll notice that this sort of thing is not necessarily uncommon in common applications. So for instance, I know that I have a few applications that I use where you'll have like an ID at the end, and you can change the ID and get to different pages to maybe view different posts or different pieces of information, right? And that's not necessarily a problem. The problem comes when you can access data that you shouldn't be able to access. So as customer 3, if I put in customer ID 1 and I'm not a part of customer ID 1's like group and I don't have those permissions, that's when the access control violation actually happens. So it's a problem when we can access data we shouldn't be able to through accessing this ID. If we can access data that we only have access to and get rejected on ones that we don't, then this isn't really a problem. But this is generally the way that we see these sort of vulnerabilities. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be through a GET request. It can also be through a POST request, but if you're doing it through a POST request, then you'd have to use another utility like burp. With that, you can sit between your client and your server, you can intercept the packet, and then you can just change the POST request to a different ID. So that's a relatively straightforward way to be able to exploit this. So this is the first type of IDOR that's really common to see. This one is the one that you're going to see in a lot of different applications, again, especially older PHP pages. So those are the ones to sort of look out for. Anytime you have this question mark and then parameters at the end of it, that will tell you that there could possibly be an exploit available. Won't always work, but sometimes it will. And those are the ones that are relatively big vulnerabilities. They're quite important, and they're something that should always be reported whenever they're available. So this is something that you can also test on your own applications to see if you can navigate to things that you shouldn't be able to. This is often referred to by a number of different names also. That's sort of an important piece to keep in mind. I know this is typically referred to as forced browsing a lot of the time, but IDOR is another name that is correct for it as well. The other type is direct reference to static files. So when I'm using my localhost directory, if I go back to the main localhost path, you'll see that I can get all of these different paths, and I can access whatever files I'd like. And you can see there's ones like conf.txt that has information about the usernames and passwords of the database, right? So obviously these are not actual valid credentials for anything. These are just fake credentials that I put in here to demonstrate my point. If a user can type in this URL here and access this URL, this page, right, they're able to gain access to information that they shouldn't be able to gain access to. And this is another thing, that the server just isn't verifying the permissions that that user has when they try to access this URL. If we instead verify that they have access to this URL before we load the page, that's when we would be able to avoid this vulnerability. But since we can directly access it through this URL, it's an instance of an IDOR vulnerability. So this is the other type that's very common, is being able to access objects like text files or code files even directly through their URLs. Also getting to like admin pages and such would be other examples of this. It's specifically if we're able to put in a specific URL and access it when we shouldn't be able to and gain information from it, that would be an example of a vulnerability. So in summary, there's the two types that are available, right? We can do direct reference through the URL, which revolves around us changing parameters to be able to view other people's data or potentially escalate our permissions. And then there's references to static files, which will allow us to expose data and objects that we shouldn't typically be able to see. So those are the two common types of IDOR that you might be able to see. And this should give you enough information to be able to spot those types of vulnerabilities inside of your applications and to be able to report and patch them. Again, the way that you fix this problem is just by verifying the information server side. Whenever a user provides an input, you should never trust that input. You always validate it on the server side before you process it. So again, whenever a client sends data, we just verify it. That's how to avoid these types of vulnerabilities.